When I turned 65, I set the table for 8 and realized I no longer had a place at it. I had spent 3 weeks planning that dinner, not because I expected anything extravagant, but because I still believed in the quiet rituals that used to hold my family together. His arm around her shoulders. My grandchildren were there too, laughing, windswept, happy. Had not been in any of their recent photos for quite some time. That thought settled into me more heavily than anything else. I walked into the living room and looked at the family portrait above the fireplace, the one we had taken 5 years ago when everything still felt intact, when Ethan still called me twice a week, when Sunday dinners were not something I had to plan alone. Asked 3 times for the exact time, and Vanessa told me it might be too crowded and confusing, that it would be better if I came to the next one. But there had not been a next one. There was only the photo posted afterward, Noah on stage, Ethan and Vanessa smiling proudly in the front row, and me nowhere in the frame, not even in the background, not even as an afterthought. At the time, I had explained it away, told myself they were busy, that young families have their own rhythms, their own priorities, that it was natural for things to change. But sitting there now, looking at everything together, I could see how carefully it had all been arranged, not in a loud or obvious way, but in small, almost polite adjustments that slowly moved me further and further to the edge until there was nothing left but space between us. Vanessa never raised her voice, never said anything openly unkind, and that was what made it so difficult to see, because she did not push me out. She simply made it easier for everyone else to step away, one invitation at a time, one suggestion at a time, always framed as concern, always presented as something that would be better for me, less stressful, more comfortable, more appropriate for someone my age. I remembered the way she would place her hand lightly on Ethan's arm when I was speaking, just enough to redirect his attention, the way she would answer questions that had been meant for him, the way she would gently laugh and say things like your mother probably needs her rest or she has had a long week, even when I had not, even when I was standing right there ready to be part of the conversation. Fit into a space that had been shrinking without my knowledge, that I had been grateful for invitations that were already half withdrawn, that I had been holding on to a version of my family that no longer existed in the way I remembered it. I sat there for a long time, not moving, letting each memory settle into place until there was no longer any confusion left, only a clear, undeniable understanding that what had happened the night before was not an accident. It was the result of something that had been unfolding for far longer than I had allowed myself to see, and once I saw it, I could not unsee it. I kept thinking about the way Vanessa spoke to me, never directly unkind, never openly dismissive, and yet every word seemed to carry a quiet weight that shifted things just enough to change how others saw me, how they responded to me, how they slowly began to treat me as someone who needed to be managed rather than included. And the more I thought about it, the clearer it became that this had not been accidental. It had been careful, deliberate, almost practiced in its subtlety. I remembered a dinner about a year ago when I had suggested hosting Thanksgiving at my house like we used to, the same house where Ethan grew up, where every holiday had once felt full and loud and warm, and Vanessa had smiled gently and said that might be too much work for me, that I should not feel pressured to take on something so big, and Ethan had nodded without hesitation, agreeing that it would be easier if they hosted instead, and I had accepted that without question, even thanked them, always with a tone of concern, always framed as kindness, as if she were protecting me from inconvenience, from effort, from the burden of being involved, and somehow that made it harder to question, harder to push back, because there was nothing obvious to resist. I could see now how easily that kind of influence could reshape a family without ever creating a moment that could be clearly pointed to as the cause, how it could slowly rewrite the roles each person played until what once felt natural began to feel distant and unfamiliar. Ethan had not changed all at once. There had been no single moment where he chose her over me, at least not in a way that was obvious. It had been a series of small decisions, small agreements, each one reasonable on its own, each one building on the last until the balance shifted entirely and I was no longer part of the center of his life, only a peripheral presence that he checked in on when it was convenient. I thought about the way he used to look at me when he was younger, how his attention had been immediate and instinctive, how he would turn toward me without hesitation, and I compared that to the way he looked now, often distracted, often glancing at Vanessa as if waiting for confirmation before responding. as if her perspective had become the one that mattered most. The realization settled into me with a quiet certainty that left no room for doubt. This was not about a missed dinner or a single forgotten occasion. This was about a shift in influence, a quiet reordering of priorities that had placed me outside of the life I had once helped build. And the most unsettling part was how easily it had happened without me fully noticing until now, until everything had already changed. The phone rang just after noon the following day, and for a brief moment I considered letting it go to voicemail, not out of anger, but because I wanted to understand what it felt like to not respond immediately, to not be available at the exact moment someone decided they needed me. But I answered anyway, because some habits take longer to change than others. Ethan's voice came through light and easy, as if nothing unusual had happened, as if the distance between us had not been growing for years, as if the night before had been just another evening that did not require explanation. He asked how I was doing in that familiar, almost automatic way, the kind of question that sounds caring but does not wait long enough for an honest answer. And before I could say anything more than "I am fine," he began talking about the trip, about the weather, about how the kids had loved the ocean and how Vanessa had found such a great deal on the cruise that they just could not pass it up. I listened without interrupting, holding the phone in one hand while my other rested against the kitchen counter, tracing the edge of it slowly, grounding myself in something solid while his words filled the space between us. He mentioned how beautiful the sunsets were, how they had taken so many pictures, how it had been exactly what they needed, and there was something in the way he said that, something casual and unexamined, that settled heavily in my chest. Exactly what they needed. Not once did he mention the dinner. Not once did he pause to acknowledge the empty table I had set, or the calls I had made, or the message I had never received. It was as if that entire evening had simply been removed from his version of events, edited out in the same quiet way everything else had been. When he finally asked if I had done anything special for my birthday, the question hung in the air for a second longer than it should have, and I realized then that he did not know, or perhaps he had chosen not to know, and for the first time, I did not rush to fill that silence for him. I said no, not really, keeping my voice steady, simple, leaving the answer as small as possible, and there was a brief pause on the other end, just long enough to suggest that something did not quite fit, but not long enough for him to explore it. He moved on quickly, mentioning that they would come by sometime next week, that the kids would love to see me, that we should plan something soon, all of it spoken in the future tense, all of it distant and undefined. I agreed in the same calm tone, not committing to anything specific, not asking for a date or a time, just letting the words exist without anchoring them to anything real. When the call ended, I stood there for a moment, the quiet returning just as quickly as it had left, and I placed the phone back on the counter with a care that felt deliberate, almost symbolic. I did not feel the need to call him back, to clarify, to remind him of what had been missed or what had been overlooked. Instead, I found myself thinking about the way the conversation had unfolded, about what had been said and what had not, about the absence of acknowledgement that spoke louder than any apology could have. It was not that he had chosen to hurt me, not in a direct or intentional way. It was that he had stopped considering me in the moments that mattered, and that kind of absence, I realized, was not something that could be corrected with a simple conversation. It was something deeper, something that had already taken root, and as I stood there in my kitchen, looking out at the quiet street beyond the window, I understood that whatever I had been holding on to, whatever version of us I had been trying to preserve, it no longer existed in the way I had believed, and more importantly, it was no longer something I could fix by simply waiting for things to go back to how they used to be. The house felt different that evening, not emptier, but clearer, as if something invisible had finally been removed, and I could see the space for what it truly was. And for the first time in a long while, I did not rush to fill it with noise or distractions or the familiar routines that had once given me comfort. I moved through the room slowly, noticing details I had overlooked before, the way the light settled across the floor in the late afternoon, the quiet hum of the air conditioning, the steady rhythm of a home that no longer depended on anyone else's presence to feel complete. I sat in the living room with a cup of tea and let the silence stretch without interruption, not as something to endure, but as something to observe, and in that stillness, I found myself thinking less about what had been taken from me and more about what I had been holding on to without realizing it. I had spent years adjusting, accommodating, making space for others in ways that had gradually reduced my own, always telling myself that this was what families did, that love meant flexibility, that understanding meant stepping back when needed. But somewhere along the way, stepping back had turned into stepping aside, and stepping aside had turned into being left out entirely. I thought about the version of myself that had accepted every explanation, every change of plans, every polite deflection without question, and I tried to understand why I had been so willing to believe that it was all temporary, that things would circle back, that the connection I had with my son was something that could not truly be replaced or diminished. But sitting there now, I could see that it had not been taken all at once. It had been given away in small pieces, each one offered freely in the name of patience and understanding, until there was very little left to hold on to. The realization did not come with regret, not in the way I might have expected. It came with a kind of quiet resolve, a recognition that if something had been lost gradually, it could also be reclaimed deliberately, not by forcing anyone to return, not by demanding explanations or apologies, but by changing the way I participated in the life that still remained around me. I stood up and walked back into the dining room, where the table now sat bare, the decorations removed, the chairs pushed neatly into place, and I placed my hand on the back of one of them, feeling the solid wood beneath my fingers, grounding myself in something real and unchanging. I did not need to set the table for 8 anymore. I did not need to wait for confirmations or hope for arrivals that might never come. And as simple as that thought was, it carried a weight that shifted something deep inside me. I turned off the lights and let the room settle into darkness, not as a sign of loss, but as a quiet acknowledgement that one chapter had ended, whether I had been ready for it or not. And as I made my way upstairs, I found that I was not thinking about what I would say the next time Ethan called, or how I would explain what had happened. Instead, I was thinking about something far more unfamiliar, what I would do next. Not for them, not for the version of our family that no longer existed, but for myself. And that question, simple as it was, felt like the beginning of something I had not allowed myself to consider before. The next morning, I did something I had not done in a very long time. I did not reach for my phone. It sat there on the kitchen counter exactly where I had left it the night before, silent and still, and for once I allowed it to remain that way without checking for messages, without wondering if anyone had remembered me overnight, without waiting for something that might not come. Instead, I opened the curtains and let the morning light fill the room, slow and steady, revealing everything exactly as it was, not softened by expectation or colored by hope. I made breakfast for myself, nothing elaborate, just toast and coffee, and I sat down at the table without setting a place for anyone else, without imagining voices that were not there, without filling the silence with memories that no longer belonged in the present. It was not sadness that settled over me. It was clarity, the kind that comes when something has ended so quietly that you almost miss it, but once you see it, you cannot pretend it is still the same. I began to look at my days differently, not as something waiting to be filled by others, but as something that already belonged to me, something I had been giving away piece by piece without noticing. I thought about the way I used to plan my weeks around Ethan's schedule, adjusting my own time to match his availability, waiting for invitations that came less and less frequently, always leaving space open just in case, and I realized how much of my life had been shaped by that waiting. It was not something I had ever questioned before. It had felt natural, even necessary, but now it seemed like a habit that no longer served me, a pattern that had quietly kept me in a place where I was always anticipating, always accommodating, always one step behind. I stood up and walked through the house again, this time not as someone searching for what was missing, but as someone taking inventory of what remained, the photographs, the furniture, the small details that had always been there, but had never been the focus of my attention. I paused in front of the hallway mirror and looked at my reflection, not quickly, not in passing, but fully, taking in the lines on my face, the silver in my hair, the expression that had changed in ways I could not quite name, but could clearly see. There was no trace of the uncertainty that had lingered there before, no quiet question waiting to be answered by someone else, only a steady gaze that felt unfamiliar, but not unwelcome. I had spent so much time being part of a family that I had forgotten what it meant to stand on my own without needing permission or validation. And that realization did not feel lonely the way I might have expected. It felt grounding, like placing both feet firmly on the ground after years of shifting balance. I did not know what would happen next. I did not have a plan or a clear direction. But for the first time in a long while, I understood that I did not need one immediately, that it was enough to recognize where I stood and to decide, quietly and without announcement, that I would no longer remain in a place where I was treated as an afterthought. And that decision, simple as it was, did not require anyone else to agree with it, did not require acknowledgement or approval. It only required that I follow through, one small choice at a time, beginning with this moment, in this house, where the silence no longer felt like something imposed on me, but something I had chosen to accept and understand on my own terms. It was the third day when the doorbell rang, a sound so unexpected that I stood still for a moment before moving toward it, not out of fear, but out of a quiet curiosity I had not felt in a long time, because no one came by unannounced anymore, not neighbors, not friends, and certainly not family. When I opened the door, I found a man standing there, mid-40s perhaps, dressed neatly, but with a kind of unease in the way he held himself, as if he had rehearsed this moment several times and still was not sure how it would unfold. He asked if I was Margaret Collins, and when I said yes, he hesitated just long enough to confirm that whatever he had come to say was not easy. His name was Daniel Harris, and he spoke carefully, choosing each word as if it mattered more than usual, explaining that he needed to talk to me about Vanessa. That name, spoken by a stranger on my doorstep, settled into the air between us with a weight I could not ignore. I invited him in, not because I trusted him, but because something in his expression told me that whatever he carried had been waiting to be said for some time. We sat across from each other in the living room, the same room that had once been filled with conversations I now replayed in fragments, and he kept his hands clasped tightly together as he began to explain. He told me that he had known Vanessa years ago, before she met Ethan, that they had been in a relationship, serious enough to talk about a future, and that it had ended abruptly, without explanation, without closure, just a sudden absence that had left him searching for answers he never found. I listened without interrupting, not reacting outwardly, but feeling each piece of information settle into place with a quiet precision that felt disturbingly familiar. He went on to say that he had not thought about her in years until recently, when he had seen a photo online, a photo she had posted, one of many, but this one had caught his attention for a reason he could not immediately explain. It was a picture of my grandson, Noah, standing near the edge of a pool, smiling into the camera, and there was something about that image, something small but undeniable, that had made him look twice, then again, until the recognition could no longer be dismissed as coincidence. He described it carefully, not with certainty at first, but with a growing conviction, the shape of the face, the line of the jaw, the way the child held his shoulders, details that on their own might have meant nothing, but together formed something he could not ignore. I did not ask questions right away, not because I did not have them, but because I could feel the direction this was moving, and I needed to understand it fully before interrupting the flow of what he was trying to say. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded envelope, placing it gently on the table between us without opening it, as if the act itself required a kind of permission he was not sure he had. He told me that he had taken a step he never expected to take, that he had quietly arranged for a test, something simple but definitive, something that would either confirm his suspicion or put it to rest once and for all. The room felt still as he spoke, not tense, not chaotic, just focused, as if everything around us had narrowed down to this one moment, this one piece of information waiting to be revealed. I looked at the envelope but did not reach for it. Not yet, because I already understood that whatever was inside would not just answer a question, it would change the shape of everything that had come before. And for the first time since that empty dinner table, I felt something shift again, not confusion, not even pain, but a quiet awareness that the truth, whatever it was, had already begun to surface, and this time, I was not going to look away. I reached for the envelope slowly, not out of hesitation, but out of respect for the weight it carried, the kind of weight that does not need to be announced because it can already be felt in the room. And as I held it in my hands, I noticed how carefully it had been sealed, as if whatever was inside had been protected not just from damage, but from being revealed too soon. Daniel did not speak as I opened it. He simply watched, his expression steady but tense, like someone who had already lived through this moment and was now waiting for me to catch up. Inside was a single sheet of paper, clean, precise, clinical in its presentation, the kind of document that does not rely on emotion because it does not need to. I read it once, then again, not because I did not understand it, but because I wanted to be certain that I was reading it as it was written, not as I feared it might be. The words were simple, direct, unmistakable, and as they settled into place, they did not bring shock the way I might have expected. They brought confirmation. A quiet alignment between what I had begun to sense and what was now clearly stated in front of me. I folded the paper carefully and placed it back into the envelope, setting it down on the table with the same steady movement I had used when I first picked it up, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. There was no need to fill the silence, no need to rush into questions or reactions that would only dilute what had already been made clear. Daniel finally exhaled, a small release of tension that seemed to come from somewhere deep, and he told me that he had not come to cause trouble, that he had struggled with whether or not to bring this to me at all, but that in the end, he felt it was something I deserved to know, something that should not remain hidden when it affected more than just him. I nodded once, acknowledging not just his words, but the decision behind them, and I realized that whatever this truth was, it did not belong solely to him anymore. It had entered my life now, quietly but decisively, and it would not leave things the way they had been. I did not ask him to stay long, not because I wanted him gone, but because I understood that what he had brought me was not something that could be fully processed in conversation. It required space, clarity, and a kind of stillness that could not exist while someone else was waiting for a response. When he left, I walked him to the door and thanked him, not out of politeness, but because I meant it, because even difficult truths carry a form of respect when they are offered honestly. After the door closed, I returned to the living room and sat down, the envelope still resting on the table in front of me, no longer just a piece of paper, but a turning point I could not ignore. I thought about Ethan, about the life he believed he was living, about the version of his family that had been carefully presented, and I wondered how much of it was real and how much had been constructed around him without his awareness. I thought about Vanessa, about the precision of her influence, the quiet control I had only recently begun to understand, and for the first time, I saw a different layer beneath it, something deeper, something that suggested that the story I had been observing was only part of a much larger picture. I did not feel anger, not yet, and I did not feel the need to act immediately. Instead, I felt something far more useful, a sense of position, of knowing exactly where I stood in relation to the truth that had just been placed in my hands. I picked up the envelope once more and held it there, not opening it again, not needing to, because what mattered was not the document itself, but what it represented, a shift in understanding that could not be undone, a line that had been quietly crossed without my knowledge and was now visible in a way it never had been before. I stood up and placed the envelope in a drawer, closing it gently, not as a way of hiding it, but as a way of containing it until the right moment, because I knew now that whatever came next would not be rushed, would not be driven by impulse or emotion. It would be deliberate, measured, and undeniable. And as I turned away from the drawer, I understood something with complete certainty. They had spent years deciding my place in their lives without asking me, but that was no longer something I was willing to accept, and this time, I would be the one deciding what happened next.